View from the Gutters presents Back Matter, Episode 9. Welcome to Back Matter, the show where we discuss the wider world of comics and have conversations we don't normally have room for on our ordinary show. On this episode of Back Matter, we discuss the evolution of superheroes in a cultural context with author and cultural historian Cory Panshin. Welcome to View from the Gutters presents Back Matter. I'm Tobiah Panshin.
I'm Joe Preti.
Why do you always have to say that like it's a question?
That's not.
Like you're figuring it out.
I specifically did not say it like it was a question today.
You said it like you were reading it off a cue card.
I said it like I was about to
a cue card where you could barely
news.
read the handwriting.
I'm Joe Preti. And tonight's headlines are, deal with it.
Anyway, today we have a very special guest on View from the Gutters. Somebody who is, I think, featured repeatedly in our discussions, but never been heard from before. My mom. Hi, Mom.
Hi.
How's it going?
It's Pennsylvania. It's wet, it's cold, it's gray. Aside from that, it's okay.
That sounds remarkably like Washington.
Yeah, except it's like sunny and pretty, and there's all leaves of gold everywhere today.
Oh, no, that was 5 minutes ago. Now it's cold and gray.
Well, wait 5 minutes more.
Yeah.
So I've mentioned my mom repeatedly on the podcast, both in the context of things that happened with me and my brother when we were kids, comic books that she put into my hands, either directly or indirectly, and just in general, in terms of like the writing that she's done with my dad and her experiences as an OG, an original geek. So I wanted to have her on the show and talk to her, kind of like the conversation that I had with Patrick a few episodes ago. So I think the first thing that we ought to do is establish my mom's nerd cred for any doubters or haters out there.
I mean, aside from the fact that Tobiah and Adam are her sons.
Well, that's true. So, Mom, where would you say that your, I guess, entrance into the geek arts began?
That's a difficult question because there were no geek arts when I was little. If you were a geek, you were a geek all by your lonesome.
Exactly. But you read like fairy tale stories as a kid, like early fantasy stuff.
I was a fan of dinosaurs from the time I was 3. I was a fan of astronomy from the time I was 4. I was a fan of Greek myths from the time I was 6 or 7. And from all of that, I got into fantasy, C.S. Lewis, then Tolkien,
and
science.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Then science fiction.
And you were really into Tolkien. I mean, this was back in the 50s, the 60s? I mean, when did the books originally come out?
All right. Well, The Hobbit was in the 30s. The Lord
Okay.
of the Rings came out in the early 50s, but I only caught up with it, what was it? I guess it was 1958.
And you were, what, like 10 or 11 years old at that point?
Yeah, 11.
Okay. And did you were you actually reading them when they came out?
No.
Okay.
I was they came out like in 53, 54.
Okay.
Your father caught up with them at that point, but he's a few years older than I am.
Right.
And actually, I caught up with my local public library was missing one of the volumes for a long time. And one day the children's librarian who knew that I'd read every other fantasy book in the library, came to me very excited and said, "Hey, we got another copy of the third volume of The Lord of the Rings."
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you went off to college. You went to Harvard.
Yeah.
In the middle 60s? 64?
63.
63.
Mhm.
And you were reading very early Marvel comics at that point.
Um,
Iron Man and Fantastic Four and stuff like that.
well, at some point that fall, the word came around that there was this weird girl on the third floor who was putting comic books up on her dormitory door, hanging from strings. And you could go up there and grab one and sit in the hallway and read it.
Nice. Very nice.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Very
that's what
early
I-
internet.
Mm.
Go and pirate somebody else's comics off the door of their dorm room.
Well, she'd had them out there deliberately as bait.
Oh, I'm sure
and
she
she
did.
And she was the one who got me and my roommate involved in science fiction fandom. And
Right.
there was no science fiction club at Harvard then. There was one at MIT. So,
And you were hanging
We
out
went-
at MIT a lot.
yeah. Yeah, Harvard was kind of intimidating. It was all Roosevelts and Rockefellers and children of the elite.
Okay.
Um,
And so kind of in that period when you were in Boston, you helped found the Northeast Science Fiction Association, which was one of the first like big science fiction fandom associations.
well, I mean, that got founded.
I mean, I know you were
Originally,
involved.
we were all hanging out at the MIT Science Fiction Society. But between people like me who'd never gone to MIT and the people who'd all graduated, it seemed to make sense to form a separate club.
Okay.
But
At the same time, like you were teaching yourself Elvish, and weren't you involved in getting Tolkien actually out to Harvard to give like a talk or something?
no. I didn't do it. It wasn't him. It was somebody who'd been his secretary and
Okay.
who had put together the glossaries that are at the end of the books now. The
Okay.
original edition didn't have a glossary at the end.
Ah.
And again, that my freshman year at college, I think it was a notice in the elevator that there was going to be a meeting of Tolkien fans in one of the other dorms, and everybody was invited.
Okay. But you
And-
did, I mean, you taught yourself Elvish at that point. I remember you telling me this.
Yeah, well, I taught myself how to write the Elvish, write in the Elvish. What are they? Not runes, because that's the dwarf stuff.
Sigils,
Whatever.
glyphs.
Whatever. And I put together the first Elvish glossary before the revised edition came out that had a lot of the words defined, just going through the books over and over and figuring out from translations and things
Okay.
as many of the words as possible. So I was involved with a couple of Tolkien fanzines, but the science fiction circles down at MIT also had a overlap with early computer geek circles.
Right.
And, things you hear about like the Tech Model Railroad Club.
I've never heard of the Tech Model Railroad Club.
Well, you haven't read enough about the early days of computer geekery.
Obviously not.
This was stuff that had been people had been doing a couple of years earlier, and they graduated, but it was still around. They'd been working out how you could run like 11 different model trains at the same time and not have them run into each other.
Okay, so like
That's
kind of
it.
early algorithm stuff.
Yeah.
Modeling. Like computer modeling.
Okay.
Yeah, well, things like, what was it, Space War, that was the first...
Oh, yeah. That
Computer
early
game.
computer game. Did you
Yeah,
ever play
with-
Space War, Joe?
Oh, no. I don't want to say that my parents were Luddites, but we did not jump on the technology bandwagon early. I mean, I didn't even have we had a computer to do basic, like, word processing stuff, but the internet, and that was all very arcane to me until I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
Well, this was pre-internet.
Yeah, well, this would have been when a computer... I mean, they were still using...
Yeah, this was when ARPANET was just first being invented, and it was in like 3 places.
Well, yeah, and like your basic computer took up an entire room.
Yeah, well, that was what Space War was like at that point. You went into a room where one whole wall was computer, and it was good enough to play it on a tiny little flickery round screen.
Like an oscilloscope?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were, hanging out at MIT in the 60s, getting involved with like Tolkien fandom and science fiction fandom and that whole thing.
Yeah, and reading comic books.
And we discovered that you had a letter printed in like Avengers number 7, ranting about how they got the geography of New York City wrong.
Yeah, where some super villain is wounded and takes 3 steps and falls into the Hudson River.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And you were like, no, it's the East River.
Mm.
Because they were on like 10th Street or something. Or 10th Avenue.
Or 10th Avenue,
yeah.
Near the United Nations or whatever. Yeah, that was when I just started reading the comics on this friend's door.
Okay.
It was one of the first of those. And, like in 1968, I had pneumonia. And when I was recovering, a friend lent me an almost complete run of Doctor Strange up to that point.
Nice. You
So
never told me about that.
Well, it was an interesting way to recover from having pneumonia.
I can imagine. What was these days in geek culture, there's a very prominent movement to kind of claim it for everybody. It's especially in comic books and video games and these things. There is a very big,
a growing movement, let's say.
Well, yeah, a growing movement. What was the culture like gender-wise back then? Like, was it a pretty even split, or was it still like at that time? Did you still have a lot more men than women, or like, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, there weren't a lot of women involved in geek stuff. Now, I had my friends at college and we were girls. I mean, but then we'd head down to MIT and it was really heavy on guys.
Well, you were, this was at the time when Radcliffe was still the female, or the girls' school that was attached to Harvard, and so you were in the girls' dorm that was no boys.
Yeah, well, the classes were all co-ed, but the dorms weren't yet.
Okay.
Right.
But it was still very male-dominated at Harvard generally? Would you say?
I don't know. There were more Harvard students than there were Radcliffe students.
Okay.
And at MIT, it was even more that way. But in part, I think because there were fewer women and, hanging around MIT or in science fiction fandom, they weren't perceived as a threat the way they seem to be today.
So it was a much more it was a greater air of acceptance at that point.
Yeah, and there weren't media fandoms and cosplayers. If you could hang around science fiction fandom and you weren't obviously just somebody's wife or girlfriend, but you were publishing fanzines and doing whatever, you were part of the gang. However you'd put it, you were accepted as a fan. There weren't any of these sorts of accusations.
I would like to see somebody accuse you of being a fake geek girl, because I can't imagine that would fly for an instant.
No, God, no.
And so by the time that Adam and I were young, or at least, that I was old enough to start remembering things, we had Tintin and Asterix and Obelix and ElfQuest and Doonesbury and Bloom County books, and you had like an old cardboard box that had like Longshot and Doctor Strange and like just a bunch of other random comic titles around. Like it was just something that was in the house.
Uh-huh.
And you were incredibly encouraging of Adam and I to read comic books. You read me science fiction and fantasy novels as bedtime stories. All the C.S. Lewis stuff and most of the Oz books and the Chronicles of Prydain, I think it is, the Black Cauldron stuff.
Yeah.
And a million Diana Wynne Jones stories.
Well, a lot of it was your father too. He was the one who'd picked up Tintin and Asterix, and he'd had some sort of connection with the people who were first inventing comics fandom out of science fiction fandom, I guess in the very early 60s.
But it was something that you were generally aware of, even if you weren't following the day-to-day evolution of Marvel and DC. I mean, by the time that I was a kid, in the 80s, like you weren't reading Watchmen or Crisis on Infinite Earths or any of those things that were kind of developing at the time. Because, I mean, we've talked about how there are gaps in your knowledge.
Yeah, well, it's spotty, but maybe not that spotty. The comics that you remember from that cardboard box were ones we bought around 1974 or so, when there was a brief period when mainstream comics were being influenced by underground comics and were getting sort of weird. So we were buying things for a couple of years there until they got less weird. Then again, I know in the 80s your father was reading a lot more of the things like Watchmen than I was, because his friend Mike would lend them to him.
Okay, I didn't know that. I mean, I knew that there were certain comics that we had, and then just a lot of stuff that wasn't there. Because Dad was buying stuff like Mouse and Nausicaa when it was first coming out in the U.S., and a lot more of the kind of indie and underground stuff, and not really getting Marvel or DC.
Yeah, well, neither of us was reading superhero comics, but he was borrowing more of the those sort of middle 80s. I don't know. Is there a term for them?
Well,
Things
I mean the 80s is when the underground, when like comics that had traditionally been underground comics that were made by much smaller presses started to come to prominence, because there was a very kind of alternative movement. People were turning away from the bigger things, and people like Art Spiegelman and Scott McCloud.
Yeah, Dad picked up the first volume of Zot when that came out.
Yeah, like the Hernandez, or Gilbert and Jamie Hernandez, like they had a presence. You had publishers like Fantagraphics and
Usagi Yojimbo was coming out for the first time.
Yeah, and Dark Horse and stuff. Finally, while they couldn't compete with Marvel and DC, they were gaining prominence. People were talking about them. So
yeah, well, also the first wave of underground comics, the tripped out hippie ones, we'd been following as long as they were a thing, which was through the middle or maybe at most the late 70s.
Yeah. Dad had his own box of comics that I only discovered later that had things like the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and Mr. Natural and some R. Crumb stuff and all of that. That I was not quite prepared for at a younger age.
I don't know.
Stuff we kept on the upper shelf.
Yes.
I don't know how one prepares themselves to read most of Robert Crumb's body of work, because it is odd even to me as an adult. But
well, it was the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Crumb did great work with Harvey Pekar too on American Splendor when they worked together. But that's a digression.
Well, I think that all of this is kind of a preamble, I guess, to kind of the ultimate point of the conversation that I wanted to talk to you about. And, since at least the 80s, when you and Dad were working on The World Beyond the Hill, and more recently with the stuff that you've been doing on your blog, you've been kind of looking from sort of a detached viewpoint about the way in which social visions kind of evolve and grow and take prominence and then kind of move aside, that I always thought was interestingly reflected in the evolution of kind of comic book ages. The way in which the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age and all that have kind of each been a response to the last one, as the conversation that especially superhero comic books, tries to have with the greater American culture kind of evolves and changes. And so I kind of wanted to get your sense of things, I guess, first in sort of reaction to the blog post that I made a month ago talking about the changes in comic book ages. And specifically, I guess, the changing position of the superhero within the cultural landscape. Since, we finally have this sort of boom of superhero movies that are engaging with a wide culture, and just the role of, like, who a superhero is and what they do changes.
Yeah, there's a wider context for this that I've been thinking about a little bit, because you asked me in those questions you emailed me about comics and mythology.
Sure.
Let me think for a moment about where to start to keep it as reasonably simple.
Sure.
Basically, I think mythologies grow out of cosmology, out of the way people see the universe.
Not cosmology in the sense of, like, these are stars, these are planets. But in terms of, like, how people conceive of the universe as a whole thing.
Yeah, not astronomy, but the cosmos.
Ontology, let's say.
Well, that's what exists. Vast cosmic forces, that sort of stuff.
Sure. Kind of like back in Newton's time, they had this idea of God as, like, the great watchmaker who spun the universe up at the beginning of time and then just has been letting it run, but doesn't necessarily take a strong hand in the day-to-day affairs of man.
Yeah. Well, that sort of thing doesn't make for superhero stories particularly.
Not so much.
That what you think of as mythology goes back to when the gods were identified with stars and planets and constellations, or when the heavens were seen as a place where you could climb a beanstalk and go and have adventures and find treasure. There was a whole sort of cosmic landscape.
Yeah, I mean, there was this idea that that what you were seeing in the quote unquote heavens in terms of astrology was a reflection of actual events that were happening between gods. That when a planet moves in a certain way through a certain constellation, that is reflective of something.
Yeah, or else that you're actually seeing something, or that it's the surface expression of great events behind the scenes.
Right.
And the whole sort of Norse thing where there's a world axis and multiple worlds somehow strung along it.
And Yggdrasil, the great world tree, the axis mundi, like literally the tree is the point in which the earth spins.
Yeah, that this was the basis of myth. That it was the basis of the sort of territory in which myths occurred, and it was the basis of the gods and the heroes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be a little bit clear on this, because I think that there's a propensity for people to think when you talk like, oh, mythology, they're like, oh yeah, like Hercules doing his 12 labors, like these are just stories. And there is that component of mythology where it's just, this is a story about a guy doing some incredible things, but that there's kind of like a higher level to it in terms of these stories are explanations of how the universe works.
Yeah, I mean, there were 12 labors because there were 12 months. Um, even the stuff that just looks like hero stories has a sort of a scientific subtext.
Okay.
But after that, there was a long period, first when the universe was reconfigured in terms of Ptolemaic spheres, where it's Earth and the sphere of the Moon and the sphere of Mercury and so on.
Right.
And it wasn't a very good basis for storytelling, because beyond the sphere of the fixed stars, out there somewhere was the ultimate, gods and angels and that stuff. But there wasn't access. You couldn't have a human hero going off and running around with angels up in the heavens. And
Okay.
then when you got the Newtonian sort of system, there were multiple, there was the idea that the stars were other suns and that there could be planets out there. And you did get the first few, like, moon voyages in the 1600s. But it wasn't...
You mean in terms of stories?
Yeah, but it wasn't really able to sustain a complete mythology the way the older stuff had. And that only changes in the late 1800s when people start first they get the idea of the galaxy. And then I guess in the early 20th century they get the idea of multiple galaxies. And they start to realize that time is not just a few thousand years, but is millions and then billions of years. And that there are these strange, intangible forces like gravitation and electromagnetism. And it's that concept of the universe as something that's incredibly vast, incredibly ancient, and is the product of invisible forces that forms the basis, first of science fiction, then of superhero stories that are as expansive as the stories of 5,000 years ago.
Okay. And this is, the same stuff that was feeding into, like, Lovecraft.
Yeah, well, it's H.G. Wells, and then it's the people like Lovecraft, and it's the start of science fiction. It's E. Smith and zipping around galactic scale battles.
Yeah, well, I mean, superhero comic books are kind of weird in that they're this kind of mishmash of time and space and aliens and magic and other planes of existence and parallel realities. It's kind of this weird mix of what we would think of as like science fiction and fantasy and mystery and these different things kind of all interplaying amongst each other, where you have alien princesses next to hyper-evolved psychics and wizards from Atlantis, kind of all bumping shoulders with each other.
Yeah, but it's been that way. I mean, that's how it came together in the late 1800s. It was time and space and other dimensions and lost races and science that could almost be magic and magic that was explained as advanced science. Every one of those pieces was there by probably the 1890s. And it's just kept on, that's why I say it was the first time in 5,000 years that you could have a canvas that had quite that much scope, that it wasn't just, Earth sitting at the bottom of a puddle somewhere. It's precisely because of this sort of galactic or cosmic scope that science fiction and comics have had a ambivalent relationship with social and earthbound issues. And that's where a lot of the stuff you were talking about in that blog post comes in. If you get too cosmic, you lose sight of people.
And writing that article, I definitely got that sense, like, as I was going, that there seems to be this swing back and forth from kind of being grounded in more mundane reality and then kind of going off into time and space and not dealing with mundane issues. And then it gets kind of too weird and too fantastic and it's not grounded. And so it kind of comes back down to earth and gets focused in political issues again. And then things kind of swing back and become more otherworldly.
Yeah, but again, that's been going on since the 1890s. I mean, H.G. Wells, after writing The War of the Worlds and The First Men in the Moon and The Time Machine, finally decided that going out and staring at the stars was all very well, but that he really needed to write social novels for a while. So he wrote a whole bunch of novels that nobody reads anymore.
Good job, H.G. Wells.
Well, and then he came back to it somewhere. I think he wrote more or less the first Parallel Worlds novel in the 1920s. What?
I said good for him.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say that it seems around this time, the 1890s going into the early 1900s, that there was a feeling between, especially in like science and mathematics, there was all this incredible stuff happening and people were discovering new things constantly. And the future seemed to be so fantastically advanced that it almost seems to me that when you go back and you look at some of that stuff, like how could people not be writing these stories? How could people not be examining these possibilities? And I've always found that kind of very interesting because you do get so much out of that. And there's some interesting stuff. For all the stuff they totally missed the mark on, there's some stuff that's very close, that gets very close to stuff we have around now and to technology that exists now. Of course, now that I'm saying it, I can't think of any. I don't have any examples on hand, but
you can totally take a balloon up to the moon.
Yeah, no, totally. I did it the other. Actually,
that's Edgar Allan Poe. You can't blame the 1890s for that.
Jules Verne loved Edgar Allan Poe.
And I will say this: last week, I want to say, or maybe earlier this week, a Google executive broke the freefall record that was set by Felix Baumgartner. He fell from 135,000 feet, and he took a balloon up there. I shit you not. He took a balloon up there, and when he reached altitude, a small explosive device popped the balloon, and he went into freefall. And every time I think about that, I'm like, how could you do that? Just at that point,
you got to have a lot of hot air.
Yeah, God. No, you have to have...
You can say it, Joe.
You have to have a great amount of...
chutzpah.
Of chutzpah. You got to have moxie. You got to have boatloads of moxie.
But I guess I wanted to delve a little bit into more of that kind of changing head state mythology thing with superheroes, because there's been quite a bit of ink spilled over the years talking about, what is the context of superheroes and the kind of the greater cultural consciousness. And because superheroes seem to be a very American thing, and America has been really this big empire since the middle of the last century. And, superheroes have been described as the solution of overwhelming force, that if you have all of these things that you're afraid of, then having this idea of overwhelming power that makes you safe from anything that might hurt you. That superheroes are really a power fantasy at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, that's why I loved Superman when I was 5 years old, because...
I think that's why everybody loves Superman when they're 5 years old.
Yeah, Superman and the New York Yankees, they both seemed invulnerable.
Yep. I also found it really... When you look back on those first superheroes and you look at, like, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon making... Captain America, right? And especially Jack Kirby, who was Jewish, making this. Wasn't he?
Yeah, no, he was.
Oh yeah, Jack.
Yeah,
Jack
he totally
Kirby,
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jack Kirby came out of the same background as my father, basically. He was born 2 years later and a few blocks away from where my father was born. But it was, Lower East Side, scuffling New York City kids.
Yeah.
So why wasn't Zeta ever a genius comic book artist? Huh?
Oh, because he didn't grow up losing himself in early pulp science fiction, I guess.
Well, not everybody can be Jack Kirby.
Oh, yeah, it's easy.
But I love this image of the Aryan ideal, this godlike, blonde, blue-eyed American superhero kicking the crap out of Nazis, or Superman, who was also, Siegel and Shuster, right? Like,
yeah, he was the Ubermensch.
And but the ultimate alien, right? The ultimate outsider, somebody who came from a different world and yet embodied an ideal so well that he was accepted wholly and completely by his adopted planet. So, I think that's I think that's an interesting play, especially when you look at the time when they were coming out, because this is all right around the time of World War II.
Yeah, well, I looked at some of the stuff up online a couple of days ago, and apparently Captain America was originally, he was Irish American, not Jewish American, but he was a scuffling Lower East Side.
Oh, yeah.
No, that's still the case. They were actually just revisiting that at the beginning of Rick Remender's run 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Him thinking about his childhood, Irish American kid, skinny as a rail, alcoholic father, put upon mother, and just his whole upbringing, on the Lower East Side of New York.
Yeah.
Like an immigrant kid.
And I mean, the Irish in New York didn't have it too much better than the Jews of New York. They were a very hated group
they'd showed up a little earlier, so they had a jump on, a generation ahead of the Jews. But,
yeah.
I mean, the question that I keep coming back to that I don't know that we've necessarily really grappled with is that, you have this uniquely kind of American invention of the superhero in the late 30s, the early 40s. And it was, it was this power fantasy. It was these incredible men with miracle powers doing incredible feats and beating up Nazis and saving the world and just being invulnerable.
Right.
And then after World War II, they kind of slowly went away. And you had Superman, you had Batman, you had kind of them around the edges, but it was, war comics, westerns, horror, romance, all these other things. And the superheroes didn't really come back until the Silver Age started up in the mid-50s with the new Flash and the new Green Lantern and Martian Manhunter and all of these science and space-based heroes. And then you had all the Marvel stuff, which was largely science and space-based heroes.
Right.
Fantastic Four and Ant-Man and the Incredible Hulk and all of these, Spider-Man. They all got their powers from science.
Oh, absolutely. Well, look at Iron Man.
And I feel like, you've kind of had the superhero evolving over time to deal with the thing that America feels either threatened by or uncertain of over the decades. Fighting communists or, aliens from the depths of space or whatever. I mean, the whole Kree-Skrull War is not about vast alien armadas. It's very much an allegory for the Cold War.
Oh, God, absolutely.
Except that at the very peak of the Cold War is when you say all the stuff died back. And
was the peak of the Cold War really 1948?
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, that's when it was invented.
Right. Well, I mean, that's when it was invented, but I always felt like the peak of the Cold War was the 70s. Or at least, I mean, at the very least, the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the buildup and all of that.
I feel like
all right.
The Cold War, because it affected so many facets of a culture, especially in this country, that finding a peak would be difficult just because it would refer to the specific aspect you were talking about.
I suppose that's fair.
There were two different phases, and this is something I've just been realizing recently. The original phase of the Cold War that started virtually as soon as World War II ended and went up until about 1956 or 57 was the super paranoid CIA, MK Ultra, fear of mind control, brainwashing, Joe McCarthy waving around lists of alleged communists. It was the Red Scare.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that fear of being infiltrated, the period of like invasion of the body snatchers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and as I said, when I was a little kid, I stopped watching the Superman TV show because there was an episode about a mind control device. And at the point where the bad guys who'd gotten a hold of it proposed to turn it on Superman, I bolted out of the room. I couldn't handle it. That was the early 50s for you.
Okay. I mean, when I think of the height of the Cold War, I think of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think of like The Prisoner.
The second phase was the sort of military-industrial complex, brinksmanship, Cuban Missile Crisis phase. It wasn't the fear that there were, of communists working in the State Department anymore. It was a purely military build-up, missile gap, Sputnik.
Yeah, they were gonna fire the missiles. They were going to invade us with an army that was unstoppable.
Well, yeah, there's infiltration. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. They could be any one of us. Which brings about things like, I mean, the Twilight Zone was full of that. The monsters come to Maple Street, right? Like, could be any one of us. And then you have what I think is like the annihilation phase of the Cold War, which was people were starting to realize the destructive capabilities of two militaries as big as the ones that were involved, and exactly what the fallout of a full-scale war between these two things would be like. This was a world post Hiroshima. This was a world post Nagasaki. This was a world that had seen full-scale destruction on a scale never before witnessed in human history. And so, I mean, that's something I remember very vividly from my childhood in the early 80s, just the threat. And it's weird because Audrey, like, will never experience that fear of nuclear war the way that I did, because that was still a very real thing. It was still something that was talked about a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, that was the case even when I was a kid. And I mean, I was only in middle school when the Berlin Wall fell down.
Yeah, well, in that sense, that first phase of the Cold War wasn't primarily scientific. I mean, there were stories about atomic destruction and mutants and whatnot, but most of it, I mean, there were communists in the U.S. at that point.
Well, I'm sure there were never not communists in the U.S.
Well, yeah.
Well, I mean, the Communist Party had been a thing. At some point, not long before my father died, I guess, he surprised me by saying, oh, yeah, back in the 30s, most of their friends were communists or socialists, and he and my mother were the weird ones because they weren't. But when I was a little kid, all these people were just my parents' friends, and I mean, they had jobs and kids my age, and they were moving out to the suburbs and doing backyard barbecues and all this sort of standard all-American stuff. And whatever radical element had been there in the 30s kind of faded back into the woodwork. But there was a reason for people to be afraid in the early 50s. Gee, my neighbor might be a communist. Because a lot of people's neighbors were communists or had been 20 years before. And by the end of the 50s, all of that had been driven back underground, the communists had been driven out of the labor unions. It wasn't a factor. The Communist Party was like, a few hundred old people and a lot of FBI infiltrators.
I remember back when Michael Moore had that first TV Nation show, he got the head of the American Communist Party in a big red tractor trailer and drove him across the country, and it was this big laugh thing. Because who could ever be afraid of this little old man?
Yeah. Well, that was what changed. And this second phase of the Cold War was really about military confrontation with the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
It wasn't about worrying about your neighbors. It was about worrying about atomic testing and ICBMs and was there strontium-90 in the milk and all of that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, just that's where a lot of those early 60s superheroes come out of. They're mutants. They're the product of atomic testing. They're, it's being bitten by a radioactive spider. It's going into outer space and encountering a a storm of cosmic rays, whatever it is that sets off the Fantastic Four.
No,
so
that's it.
Was, yeah, all right. That it had this very scientific quality, and it probably goes along with the wave of monster movies at the end of the 50s, like The Blob.
Oh, yeah, and the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, and whatever it was with the giant ants.
Them.
That's what it was.
That was a little earlier, because that was when I was 6 or 7, but
in any case.
But there was a huge wave of them, yeah. But there was a change, and I think it goes along with your Silver Age 1956 thing.
In any case, you have the superhero as this power fantasy. And we're fighting against the communists. Evil empire, supervillains. Like, supervillains are very much a kind of Cold War, like us versus them. We have our powers, they have their powers, eternal conflict kind of thing. And coming out of the Cold War in the early 90s, there was kind of this weird period where people didn't really seem to know what to do with superheroes. And you have, like, secret alien invasions, like in Wildcats, and government conspiracies, like very X-Files. And, superhero comics got very over-the-top and very fantasy-driven in the 90s. And then they kind of got pulled back to earth in the 2000s with the war on terror and fighting terrorists. And we kind of have this new existential enemy to fight. Thank goodness. We have something for our superheroes to do. And they got involved in, Marvel had like Secret War and Civil War. And you just had all of these weird kind of underground conflicts with, cells of terrorists and supervillains working with arms dealers. And as the kind of the war on terror and that whole period gets long in the tooth, I think that we're again kind of confronting the question of what is a superhero? What do they do? What is their role in society? And what do you do with them in the 21st century now that, World War II is 70 years gone. The Cold War is 30 years gone.
Well, if you're Marvel, you make billions of dollars off of them.
Yeah, well, there is that. But I'm talking more in a sociological and a mythological sense.
I know, and it's
what
funny
is the role of superheroes going to be?
Because references to superheroes keep coming up. You listen to interviews with people like Naomi Klein or Russell Brand or whatever, who are out there trying to save the world. And they might refer to Batman or whoever as a reference point, but it's not a role model reference point. And I haven't quite figured out what's going on, except it seems to be we're all trying to save the world, but you can't do it as Batman.
This is actually something I've written about for the podcast blog about. I find myself wondering more and more if there is this big, I think, Batman has become this pop culture touchstone for people, even people that don't read comic books, and then I think it's more than just the Nolan movies. I think that, especially in our country, but throughout the world, there are a lot of people that are angry over the fact that their lives, the decisions that affect their lives the most, are not being made by them. They feel powerless. They feel disenfranchised. And Batman is a very easy character to relate to when you feel that way, because he solves his problems, at least in the pop culture sense, in the pop culture ideal of Batman, he solves his problems with violence. He screams at them, he punches them, he kicks them, he throws them off of buildings.
He asks them where are the drugs.
And there's this big pop culture kind of pushback against Superman, he's uninteresting, he can't be related to, he's a big blue Boy Scout, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at Superman is consistently written as somebody who uses violence as a last resort. He's very much about positivity. He believes in people. He believes in the inherent goodness of people. He is a character that's based very firmly in love and understanding, whereas Batman is based very firmly in cynicism and violence. And so, I mean, I agree. I agree with the people that are like, you can't save the world as Batman. And I find... Well,
there's also the fact that Batman is representative of the 1%.
Oh,
he's the guy who has all the money and can do whatever he wants.
Oh, absolutely.
And his superpower is that he has money.
Well, and the interesting thing to me, and the thing I wonder about, is that, and I think the thing that gets left out is that regardless of his fortune, Batman is a very intelligent person. He's been schooled, he's been trained, and the vast majority, there are many, many Batman stories where he does not solve his problems with violence. He does it by thinking about them, by learning about them, and then by basically circumventing violence. And people don't seem very interested in that Batman.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate.
It is, because that's the kind of thinking we need, I think. I think that is how you save the world. But
except what kinds of problems is he able to solve?
Well, and that's, yeah.
And that's, I mean, that's really the issue.
That's what I'm picking up, that when people talk about saving the world, they're talking about global warming or just the general, ongoing level of violence and exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're Superman or Batman or whoever, how do you deal with Ebola? How do you deal with these ISIS people in the Middle East?
Punching Ebola.
Mm.
Well, and I think there have been, and this brings me back to the reason I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of modern superheroes and superheroes through the ages as they relate to these kind of older myths. And the thing I find fascinating is that, and you don't get this, I think the Marvel movies have been much better about doing this, but you have a lot of characters, especially in Marvel, these scientific characters that are doing things like, oh, I'm going to release my cure for leukemia today, and then I have a press conference. This is big in like Fantastic Four and Iron Man and stuff, where they are like consistently using this huge amount of brain power they have and the funding they have to tackle these things. And it feels to me very much in the way that, like, in the old mythology where you would have a character like Prometheus, or characters that used guile or cunning to steal things that would benefit humanity from the god and gift them to humanity, and or even things of that nature. And I wonder, it seems very mythological when you look at characters like Reed Richards or Tony Stark, or even Batman, who, like, while he definitely punches a lot of things, he also is very heavily involved in doing these. There's also been scenes where, like, him through his companies and subsidiaries of his companies do things like work on solving this problem or that problem, irrigation in Africa, or blah blah blah, the homelessness and things of that nature. They feel like very mythological figures. They feel like these characters that are stealing the secrets of science and teasing them out through long hours and hard work at the dry erase board, and then giving them to humanity and asking very little in return. And so I wonder what the connection there is. I mean,
yeah. The thing is, it's very top down. It's very scientific. I mean, even Prometheus is kind of a savior story. It's, gee, this one guy's going to steal fire to the gods and give it to the rest of us. And the problems at the moment are not problems with top-down solutions. Ebola isn't just a disease that happens to have broken out. It's a disease that got out of control in a specific area of West Africa that's been defoliated, that's been subject to international corporations coming in and grabbing off land and planting crops for export rather than food crops for the people to eat locally. It's the result of a damaged ecosystem. And on the other hand, there was something I was looking at the other day about an area in Ethiopia that was on the verge of being desert, where the land couldn't support the people anymore. And maybe 10 years ago or so, they started pushing for replanting.
Yeah, I just heard about this, that they've been reforesting areas in Ethiopia, and it's been wildly successful, and they're talking about by the end of this decade doing something like 30 million hectares more.
Yeah, but the way they did it was by getting everybody to devote 3 months of the year to building little stone walls and planting grasses and doing this stuff. Now, unless you're going to send Superman over and have him do Superman stuff to run all over Ethiopia building little walls and planting things, it's not a Superman-style problem or a Superman-style solution.
Well, and in the modern age, it's not. And that's what's interesting, is that there have definitely been Superman stories where he did stuff like that, where he would go and be like, I mean, nothing specifically related to that, because I think that when these stories were being told, and like in the Silver Age, but also early into the modern age, where you had you would have Superman come back to the Watchtower and say something like he was doing this.
He was fighting wildfires in the Amazon.
Yeah, or well, something that would specifically deal with the betterment of not just a community, but the global community. So he was helping to replant, or like he was using his.
He was going off and doing things like, fighting desertification or famines or diseases or whatever. And they were never very specific.
And you don't see that as much now. Like, the problems of the Justice League are much more like invasion or interpersonal, and like you don't see that as much. I'm sorry, go ahead. What were you?
No, just, even if a Superman could do something like that, it wouldn't work long term, because half the point is you get people involved, that you have them do this for 3 months a year, and now it's down to, 1 month a year, that they realize that letting their goats overgraze the land is just going to destroy it, that people have to get invested and do it for themselves.
Yeah.
And it's not a superhero sort of a problem.
No, I agree completely, and I think this harkens back to something you posted a very in response. You posted a comment on the website in response to our back matter on Tarot, Witch of the Black Rose, which I thought nailed the entire problem with that comic, which is, instead of addressing the real life problem that's going on there, they created a fantasy world in which that problem could be dealt with in a very A to B solution. And I think it feels like that's what you're saying now, that like you can't solve these problems, these like Ebola and things of that nature, and even things that are much more insidious, things like racism, sexism, violence, things of that nature. There is no A to B solution to solving those. They take fluid solutions, and they take people working together, and people choosing to expand the way they think, or people choosing to think in different ways. And
well, occasionally there's an A to B solution. Like, Superman could fly around the world and punch every gamer gator in the nose. And that would solve the problem.
With the Flash. Superman and the Flash. That is a comic book I would read.
But, I mean, yes, I think that you're both correct in the sense that the problems that we have today aren't about some sort of existential enemy that we have to fight against. It's about how do we all live together And how do we make this world the best possible world? Because we're outgrowing it.
No, absolutely.
There's not enough space. There's not enough food. There's not enough good land. And we have to make the most, we have to fix the land. We have to deal with our issues of, how do we allocate food?
Yeah.
I mean, I was just reading a thing that said something like 1/3 of all food produced in the world is wasted.
Oh, yeah.
And the amount that is wasted is more than the amount that would be needed by the number of hungry people there are in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
These are definitely fixable problems, but they're not fixable with punching.
Well, it's resource management. That's the bit. It's like nobody wants to take the steps, right? We're not. I don't look at it so much as we're outgrowing the planet as the fact that we suck at resource management.
Well, let me put it this way: we had a superhero based around exactly this issue. You know who it was?
Captain Planet.
He's
our
Captain
hero.
Planet, and that was an awful program.
Oh God, it was.
Captain Planet was terrible.
Except, you know what? A few weeks ago, when there was a Flood Wall Street protest and a bunch of people were arrested.
Uh-huh.
The ones arrested included 2 girls in Captain Planet costumes.
Nice.
With like turquoise wigs.
That's awesome.
That actually is awesome. But that's just the point that I'm making is that like Captain Planet is like a very little kiddie cartoon. Like you're taking issues like pollution and animal poaching and nuclear power or nuclear fallout, I guess, and you're turning them into cartoonish villains.
Well,
because how do you have a non-cartoonish villain who's like, I'm going to build a pollution factory in the rainforest?
Yeah, right. Because you can't have a 6-episode arc where Captain Planet is like goes to Big Pharma and says, why are you jacking up prices on AIDS medication in Africa by 6,000%?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can't punch that, right?
Captain Planet does patent reform. Like it doesn't quite work.
It's been striking me as we've been talking, though, that there's another aspect to the superhero. And it has to do with that invulnerability thing, but not in the 5-year-old, wanting to be invulnerable sense. It's more like the Superman question of how do you feel confident enough in the world to not be scared, not be aggressive, not try to squash everybody who might threaten you, but how do you have the courage to go out and do the things that most people would be afraid to do? And one answer is, if you're Superman and you know that bullets are going to bounce off you, you can wade in and deal with the low-level crooks, which is what Superman was originally about.
Yeah. That's something that Grant Morrison has talked about in his depictions of Superman. Like, the way he sees Superman is somebody who is 100% relaxed at all times because he knows that nothing can hurt him. Like, he's not afraid of things, and so he's able to confront them calmly and without fear because he knows that they can't hurt him. So he can, like, if there's a alien invasion confronting the world, he can go and talk to the aliens, and he's not afraid of them.
Unless they're magical.
Unless they're magical.
Kryptonite.
Or made of kryptonite. And so, I think that is definitely an aspect of the superhero identity.
Well, there's a lot of that in the original Star Trek, where it's a future where the warring nations on Earth have gotten over it, have become unified, and it's possible for a Captain Kirk to go out and confront the Klingons who are, who can't keep their temper, or the Romulans who are sort of insanely militaristic, because he's more relaxed. He's not driven by this stuff. And that might be the real key to the superhero. I mean, if superheroes are still viable, it's not because they have the power to solve problems by force or even by superior scientific laboratories. It's that they have the ability to solve problems because they're not bothered by the things that ordinary people are bothered by. Yeah,
I think that you're definitely onto something there. Not like I'm so powerful I can overcome any obstacle, but I'm safe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not bothered by the scary things, and so I can look at them as they are and not as I imagine them to be.
Yeah.
Like, the big thing in Lovecraft was that existential horror of the depths of time and space and all of that stuff. And just having a character who goes, oh, well, that doesn't really bother me, so I'm not going to go insane at the sight of the thing from space, the color from outer space or whatever it was. Just not freaking out at those things is a superpower in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so, I think that there's definitely something there.
Oh, yeah, there was this sort of hippie science fiction novel in the 1960s, The Butterfly Kid, where the point of it was the aliens are invading using this weird reality-altering drug that's going to freak out everybody on Earth to the point of making them easy to conquer. But I guess the aliens do a test run by releasing it in Greenwich Village in 1967. And, it's all hippies saying, hey, man, this is really cool stuff. And, I think they eventually turned the reality-altering powers back on the aliens. Well,
I always knew aliens had the best LSD.
Yeah, right?
So, it's about how, and in a sense, that's a how do ordinary people become superheroes story, because it's, hey, you get this weird alien drug and suddenly you can conjure butterflies out of thin air. Well,
I think that also, serves as an entry point for a solution for the conversation that's happening kind of in geek culture right now in terms of the whole sexism thing and the gamer gators and all of this. Is I think that you do have a lot of fear there that a lot of these people are, and I'm not sure if I feel 100% comfortable using this term, but they're social misfits. They're incredibly awkward. They don't know how to relate to people. A lot of them have suffered from bullying, or they have autism issues where they don't necessarily know how to relate to people. And geek culture, especially in the comic book and video game arena, is a safe space for them. They feel comfortable there, like they can hide from the things that they don't feel safe around. One of those things being women. And I'm painting with a very broad brush here, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think that there's something there in terms of presenting this idea of, like, you don't have to be afraid of other people. It's okay. You're safe. They're not, the fact that a girl wants to read the same comic book as you or wants to play the same video games as you isn't going to hurt you. You're okay.
I struggle with this a lot because I don't necessarily know that, while I think that's definitely the case for some of the loudest voices in the shouting match. I don't think it's quite a conversation yet that's going on right now in geek culture. But I think the danger in that is it ignores the fact that I think there is an equally large population that either don't want to deal with this or don't. Like, I think the bigger problem is not the loudest voices that are going, women don't belong here, this is our thing. I think the biggest problem are the guys that are going here and going, I don't see a problem with this. Like the men that immediately respond to, that woman is clearly a male fantasy, and they respond to that with, but look at the men, they're all heavily muscled, they're all blah, 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 and don't see that is also a male fantasy. I think that it's, there's a saying, if you take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves. And I think it's like, it is that kind of, those smaller insidious thoughts that are, I won't say more dangerous or more detrimental.
Insidious?
And yeah, I love that idea, because I really look at these problems, and they are, because they weave their way. They weave their way into an ideology and they stay there. And because they're so ingrained in the fabric of that ideology, they're incredibly hard to tease out. And when you do finally tease one out and you hold it up and you go, look at this. This is not a good thing. We should not be endorsing this. And we do it with our silence. We do it by not refusing to fucking talk about it. We do it by refusing to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge it so we can get past it and move beyond it. And everybody goes, fuck you, why are you trying to take this thing away from me? Pardon my language. But that's the conversation. Like, go onto any message board that's about Gamergate. Go onto any message board that's about the Spider-Woman cover. And that's pretty much the response to any criticism. Is, this is my thing, and I hate you for trying to take it away from me. Like, but under that, there's a lot more people going, I don't see the problem. And that's I think the worst thing is I don't see the problem.
Well, this is, it's like the equivalent of white privilege. Which is also a lot of people saying, I don't see the problem.
Yeah.
And it ties back into this thing of feeling safe. That you've got guys who don't feel safe because they're threatened by having what's been special to them taken away if outsiders come in. But then you have women who don't feel safe if they can't go to conventions without being groped or can't complain about sexism without getting death threats.
Yeah,
I think it's an all of the above issue.
Yeah,
there isn't there's no one pure solution. It's a whole system that needs to be uprooted.
One of those, I feel like the thing is that you have a dominant populace that is like pretty much saying, and I don't like, I mean, I say this out of all the frustration I have, I'm emotionally unable to deal with this. And then you have a populace that's going, we are physically in fear for our well-being. And like, I fear is a powerful and potent emotion, no matter why you're feeling it. But I feel like one of these things we can solve by having a rational conversation, and the other just, we need to have a zero tolerance policy about. But I agree, it is about, I do agree that it is about being afraid.
But that's why I'm saying that the essence of a superhero may be that they feel safe and that they can set an example of how to feel safe and how do you act when you do feel safe.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think that would definitely explain why people, and I think it's a BS argument, but people that say things like, I can relate to Batman more than I can relate to Superman. It's like, oh, you're an ultra-violent, billionaire that has no friends and no, at the first sign of trouble will neglect and turn your back on everybody that loves you and cares about you and knows you. That's really who you want to relate to, right?
Well,
and it's because Batman doesn't have any fear. He makes other people afraid.
Yeah.
Like, nobody is running around going, I'm really afraid of Superman.
Which is funny.
Yeah, because, I mean, he's like the guy that can vaporize you from space, but that's not his whole milieu, right? It's like, it's not his thing. He's very much about not making people afraid, no matter who you are.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's actually, that makes a lot of sense.
It does. So I guess we're kind of winding down here. I feel like we had a really good conversation.
Yeah.
Joe, were there any other questions that you wanted to ask?
I do too. I do, because I feel like the interesting thing to me is, like, we talk about superheroes being this very American invention, but like, look at myths about like Gilgamesh and Hercules and all these characters from like Odysseus, right? Who used these exceptional abilities to kind of get shit done, right? Like, isn't that kind of in the same vein? Aren't they kind of like, I guess my question is, how is Gilgamesh not a superhero? How is Hercules not a superhero?
I would say that they definitely are.
Yeah, I guess that was...
Then is your question really, why are superheroes predominantly an American thing?
Well, no, I guess my question is, well, are they? Like, or do we see superheroes? Can you consider mythological figures like Gilgamesh or Hercules or Odysseus or...
Well, I think that superheroes are very much cast in those molds.
Yeah.
These were the prototypes for what superheroes ultimately became. I mean,
That's
Hercules is
why-
a superhero in Marvel Comics.
Well, that's why I said at the beginning, superheroes are characters with cosmic powers. And Gilgamesh or Hercules, these heroes who were part god, they were blending. They were part human, but they also had the astronomically based powers of the gods.
Like, they had cosmic powers.
Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. All right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
all I had.
Mom, was there anything else that you wanted to contribute to the conversation? Any questions that you had for us, or just other thoughts that you might have had?
Would you like to tell an embarrassing story about Toby on air? Because I will totally release it.
No. She's too good for that.
I'm sure he's appreciative.
If you want the embarrassing stories, ask Adam.
Yeah, no, I do frequently. This is the best part about having both of you living together, is I can always count on Adam to be your big brother first.
All right. Well,
I'm just trying to think if there's anything else, but, really, I mean, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen to superheroes, what's going to happen to comics. The world is going to change. Attitudes are going to change.
yeah. Well, I think that's definitely the one constant in life, is that things are going to change.
Yeah, and you don't know ahead of time how.
I mean, we keep talking about this, sexism and misogyny and Gamergate and all of this stuff that's kind of coming to light, and the genie's not going back in the bottle.
Mm-mm.
Like there's a lot of Sturm and Drang happening, but at the end of the day, things are going to play out, and they're not going to be the same as they were.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I'll say this, I can conceive of a world without superhero comics, but I don't think we will ever go back to not. Like, comics have been just such, they've been around for a long time, a lot longer than there have been superhero comics. And I don't think we'll ever see a world without that. I think it's an incredibly effective storytelling technique. I think it's a powerful medium for doing multiple things. And I think that's why you have, people think superheroes, but you have guys like Joe Sacco, like look at Harvey Pekar, look at people that are telling stories, like actual biographies of people. And these are highly regarded works that are in a graphic format. And
I think Patrick put it the best when he said it's just lines on paper.
Yeah.
Like, that's all it is. Comics are never going to go away as long as people have pens.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the question is whether superheroes are going to keep on going.
And that's a question.
Whether they're too tied to the specifics of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think the more I think about it, the more I think they are. I don't know that superheroes will go away completely, but they've metamorphosed so many times.
I think that if they're going to continue into the 21st century and beyond, they're going to have to become something different than what they've been.
Absolutely. Which makes sense, because if you look at Batman in the 30s and 40s, and you look at Superman in the 30s, 40s, they are, like, Superman's pushing people in front of trains, he's dropping people off of buildings, Batman's carrying a gun. Like, these were not altruistic, magnanimous heroes. These were, like, very much out of that, like, crime does not pay. We're going to drop you off a building. And in the next panel, Superman's talking to Lois Lane. And there's no mention of the fact that he just cold-bloodedly killed somebody without any kind of, any kind of ride through the justice system, right? Like, and if you look at it now, people will be like, no, Batman doesn't kill. Superman doesn't kill. These are, like, the base tenets of their beliefs. And it's like, well, that wasn't always the way they were. Wonder Woman was tying people up and spanking them and getting tied up and spanked. And, like, that hasn't happened for a really long time in a Wonder Woman book. So I think...
Well, It might get to be more like role-playing games where you have a whole range of characters who have certain powers or certain magical devices, but who aren't, the strongest or the most magical or the most anything in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly we've been trending that way for a long time.
Absolutely.
I mean, you look back at those Golden Age stories, and it's like, and on this page, Wonder Woman is going to use the Paradise Island time machine to go back to the 1860s.
I think that was more of a Silver Age trope.
Sure.
But, I mean, no, definitely.
Even in the Golden Age, and I'm thinking about it like Captain Marvel, the DC Captain Marvel, the real Captain Marvel.
The only Captain Marvel.
That's right. Like, he would just, go off into outer space and other dimensions and stuff. Or at one point... my dad had these oversized reprints of classic DC comics, and one of them was the Spectre.
Uh-huh. And
there was this guy, there was just this monster, and he and the Spectre had a race from one end of the universe to the other. Like you do.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's just a thing that happened. Like, there wasn't really any limitations put on them in terms of what they could and couldn't do.
Were you not aware that cosmically powered beings race across the universe all the time?
Oh, yeah, all the time. And in this day and age, there's a much, I think, greater constriction in terms of, this character has these powers. These are the things that they do. And what they do with those powers kind of stretches and, whatever the opposite of stretching is. Contracts. Thank you.
It's all good.
But there's a general sense that this character does this kind of thing. And you have to draw a line from point A to point B to get them to do something weird with that power.
And, yeah, I think that's bothersome.
And when, Magneto can suddenly magically heal people with the power of magnetism,
so,
people are like, no, that's
you
not
cannot
a thing.
cite a Grant Morrison run as any kind of canonical thing.
Oh, no, that's what I'm saying. It's unbelievable. People are like, no, he can't do that.
But, I mean, I think
when back in the 40s, Superman was using his X-ray vision to set stuff on fire.
Yeah,
because apparently the comic book writers didn't know how X-rays work.
No.
And he was just inventing new superpowers every other week.
Well, and that's, I think, one of the reasons you see less of that is because now you're writing Superman. You can go and, do a week's worth of research on how he could, use this superpower to do this weird thing. Or, you can have some basic understanding of something. Back then, it was just you could get away with that because your average reader wasn't going to hop on Wikipedia and be like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I actually kind of miss that. I miss that exploration of I'm just going to do this and then this will work because science in general. That's just the way science works, right? Yeah, we're all agreed on that.
You just make up a thing and then that's what happens. That's science.
I mean, I think we're good as long as the Flash can still run around the opposite way around a tornado and get rid of it. I'm all good. That's all I really need. That's all I really need.
Totes. All right. Well, good talk, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mom.
It's been fun.
It was good talking to you.
Yeah. It was nice to have a conversation.
All right. Well,
conversation is always a good thing.
I agree.
Indeed. All right. Well, bye, Mom. I love you. Good night, everybody out there in podcast land.
Yes.
We will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening to this presentation of View from the Gutters. View from the Gutters is featured on theouthousers.com and the Comics Podcast Network. Keep up to date with everything that we're doing on our website at viewfromthegutters.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes, as it does help new listeners find our show. Thanks for listening, everybody. And as always, keep reading.